We have a lot to cover in class this morning, doing 2 epistles. And we'll have to find us a fast horsey to get it all done. So, book of Philemon, and then if you want to go ahead and mark Philippians, we'll get to that just in a short order. This is the 18th class, so we're nearing the end of the quarter, almost there. And let's first, we're going to summarize both letters. We can't, of course, get to any of the textual details. We just don't have the time for that. That would be for other classes. So let's just see what we can do to best summarize these 2 letters. These 2 letters will have in common what we've been talking about the last 2 classes, which were summaries of Ephesians last Lord's Day, and then this past Wednesday night we did Colossians. So these are the 4 prison epistles that Paul wrote during his first Roman imprisonment. And you see on the chart there, we continue to reference Acts 28, verses 30 through 31. That's the end of the Acts record or account that Luke wrote, where the story ended with Paul being in prison in Rome for 2 years. In this short letter, there are 3 references to Paul being a prisoner. That's verses 1, 9 through 10, and 13. The 1-chapter book, so there's no chapter indications when you look at Philemon. Just for general purposes, it's the shortest of all the 13 letters that Paul wrote in the New Testament. And it's the only epistle in what we call in the group of the journey epistles, the only one that Paul wrote to an individual. All those were written to local churches or to brethren, to saints. But this is written to one man. And the story is quite dramatic and very compelling. It's a beautiful book. Only in these 2 books we're looking at this morning, which is the book of Philemon, verse 22, and then those references there in Philippians chapters 1, those passages listed, and chapter 2. We do have information that leads us to believe very strongly that Paul was released after this 2-year imprisonment. So that's why when we look at the New Testament, at least in our studies here, you'll hear us in classes talk about the first imprisonment and then the second imprisonment. So Paul was released after this 2 years of being detained, and then he was re-arrested or re-imprisoned, I guess you could say. And in that situation, then he was martyred for the cause of Christ. So he actually mentions in these 2 letters that he has every expectation of being released. So we infer from that he was. And it's not stated in this letter as it was when Tim went through Ephesians last Sunday, and then we covered Colossians Wednesday night. Those verses listed there on the chart. But all right. So in other general information, we learned these things. Based on verses 1 and 2, Philemon hosted the church at Colossae in his home. You'll see as Paul writes there. Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our beloved brother and fellow worker, to Apphia, our sister, and to Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church in your house. So, of course, it was not uncommon in the New Testament days for churches to be hosted in homes. They didn't usually have buildings like this. We can find other examples where the churches were in people's homes. And so, in the city of Colossae, Philemon hosted the church. Based upon verse 2, now this is an inference, and I believe the Waldrons make this point in their book, and I believe it's correct. The name Apphia is feminine, so we infer that would be his wife. And Archippus, it's inferred, was his son, and that is usually said because of the way verse 2 reads. He mentions Apphia and Archippus, and to the church in your house. So he seems to lump them all together. Now, that can't be proven, of course, and really, not sure it really have to be proven. The church met in Philemon's house. That's all we really can say with certainty. But it's usually inferred that that was his wife and that was their son. We do know, I believe we can say, based on Colossians 4 and verse 17, we looked at this past Wednesday night. As you recall, when Paul was bringing that letter to a close, he told the Colossians to say to Archippus, it's the same name, same gentleman, take heed to your ministry. So Archippus did some preaching. He had a ministry. So if that be the case, then it looks like that Archippus served as the evangelist in this local church, that he maybe did most of the preaching. He had a ministry. So whatever that was and however long ago it happened, we don't know. But he's making an appeal. So that's really the background to the letter in its general points. Now, what happened that led up to this epistle? Well, Philemon had a slave. His name was Onesimus. And what had Onesimus done? He ran away. Now, if we were slaves, we might be inclined to run away because you didn't have a life, you didn't have any rights, you didn't have anything. If we stop right here and just ask this general question, what kind of a master do you think Philemon would have been based on what you know so far? Good one, bad one? Could have been. But the way, I'm just asking the way that Paul begins this letter reasoning with him. He calls him his beloved brother, fellow worker. I get the idea he was a faithful Christian. And in my mind, I have a hard time seeing a faithful brother being a harsh and strict master. He could have been, I don't know. But be that as it may, Onesimus, he wanted his freedom, so he ran away. If you remember your map, I didn't put a map on today's chart, but you remember where Colossae was? Could have been. Sort of in interior Asia Minor. I'm just asking the way. Rome. Now, how far apart are they? They're a long ways away. Where had Onesimus wound up when he ran away? He went to Rome. Long ways away. The chart got ahead of me there. Through divine providence, somehow Onesimus met who? He met Paul. And if that's not enough to be a very dramatic story, what else happened? Paul converted him to Christ, taught him the gospel. So now, Onesimus is a Christian. Look at verse 11. Here's an interesting footnote. When Paul is starting this appeal, verse 10, I appeal to you for my child, whom I have begotten in my imprisonment, Onesimus, who was formerly useless to you, but now is useful both to you and to me. Your version may say profitable or unprofitable. Does anybody's Bible have a marginal note about Onesimus' name? What does Onesimus mean? It means useful. Isn't that interesting? So Paul does a play on words here, so to speak. Here's a man whose name meant useful. And he ran away. What kind of slave was he then to a Philemon? Totally worthless. Useless. But somehow through God's providence, Paul and this runaway slave meet. Paul teaches him the truth. And now Paul says, I'm sending him back to you so that he'll be both useful to you and to me. It's a beautiful point, I think, that's often overlooked in this short little book. So, what do you think Paul told him? Based on what you know how the story goes, when he learns the truth, and let me ask this general type question. When one obeys the gospel, we know that changes one's standing before God, obviously. But does obeying the truth change everything in your life? It does not. In this situation, what did it not change? He's still a slave. See, there are still cultural things, cultural truths that exist. First century culture, our culture. And certainly we want all men to obey the truth, absolutely. But that doesn't change everything.